Hello everybody, good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Kirsty Taylor, and we are running these sessions as part of Bradford Producing Hub. So I'm going to do the formal introduction now because we've got an amazing facilitator for this session. And the session is titled Taking Your Words Off the Page to Global Stage with the amazing Suhaiymah Manzoor-Khan. She's a poet, an educator and a writer from West Yorkshire. Her work grapples with questions of history, race and power, interrogating the political purpose of narratives about Muslims, migrants, gender and violence. So over the next hour and a half, we're going to hear about her journey as an artist, reflect on making work that's based on history, race and power. We're going to participate in an exercise, and we'll also have chance for a question and answer session at the end. So thank you so much, Suhaiymah, for joining us, and over to you.
Perfect, thank you so much. So hi and salam alaikum everybody who's popped in. So to start with, I should tell you about me. My parents migrated to the UK in 1962, so a long time ago now. And they came as babies, but it was my grandparents who came, and they came to work in the factories that were in Bradford at that time, post-war. And so I'm the grandchild of those grandparents, and I grew up kind of between Bradford and Leeds. I grew up more in Leeds, but I always feel like because my grandparents were in Bradford and we would go there every weekend, I feel a real connection to both cities. I think there's a lot of things that will come out through this today, and feel free to just if you have any questions that you don't know how to hold on to, just put them in the chat box and we can come to them as well at the end. But otherwise, we'll definitely have like a Q&A. And I just want to preface this by saying, there's nothing that I can teach or give you that you don't already have yourselves. And I think some of you already know that. And some of you, I think, are just here. Sometimes I think we go to things like this just to get permission. And sometimes I think we're just waiting for permission for somebody to say, it's okay to write that thing. It's okay to speak that thing. And what's interesting is when I work with children, so I say ages 5 to 11, that's the best people to do poetry workshops with, because they don't ever need prompts. They don't need any they don't have an issue with confidence. They don't need you to tell them how to be courageous or anything like that, because they kind of don't have all the fears that we then have to internalize through growing up in the world. So yeah, I just wanted to preface by saying I don't think there's anything I will share today that will be potentially I don't know, educational to you, but I do hope through sharing my reflections and my journey, we might all just kind of be able to be mirrors to one another and see ourselves in each other, and in that sense then give each other a leg up. So yeah, to start with, I guess I'll say I am a poet, which I think is a really weird thing to say, and something that feels very unlikely and something that I wouldn't have expected myself to be saying at any point in my life. I've performed poetry in New York, in Las Vegas, in Los Angeles, in Berlin, in London, around the UK, in Edinburgh. And that to me, I say that only because I find that perplexing. To me, that is really hilarious. And if I had met myself 5 years ago and said that to her, she would just be like, no, that's not true. That's obviously a lie. Why are you saying that? And so I guess what I'm trying to convey there is just that this journey that I'm about to share with you is also one that is as unplanned and unexpected to me as it may seem to be to an observer. And in that sense, it's not that I'm going to give you some sort of template that's like, this is how you share your poems, but instead maybe just some suggestions about things that seem to have worked, that have been surprising on that way. And so one thing to say is that when I thought about poetry when I was maybe at school or when I was younger, I didn't think poetry was anything interesting or particularly cool. I thought poetry was actually quite a bit boring, and I was really only exposed to English poets and poetry within the school system. So it was always about nature, which is fine. Nature's good. I like nature too, but it didn't feel like it was really about the things that life is about and that are important. So I was like, okay, fine. We can study this, but it doesn't mean anything to me. And my interest really actually was more in history, and I went to university to study history, and that's where I was interested in how things work and how things come to be as they are. And I never thought that those two things were connected at all. They just seem completely disconnected, right? However, when I was at university, maybe sort of age 16, 17, 18, let's say there, 19, I found myself a lot of time on YouTube watching like slam poetry and spoken word poetry and just different types of poets and different types of people. And a lot of them were US based. And obviously, there's such a rich tradition of particularly African American poets and artists who I think brought that political edge to poetry that I didn't realize poetry could have for me. And so they were talking about topics like racism, they were talking about topics like history, but they were not doing it in a really obvious way. They were just talking about their experiences. But through talking about their experiences, they were highlighting all these really important things to do with the world. And so that really appealed to me. And when I was studying, I actually was having a really difficult time. I was quite depressed in my first year and my second year maybe. And the college nurse, like counselor person who you can go to see, I went to see her and she said to me, she asked me quite a few things, but one thing that she asked me was, she said to me, what's something that you've always wanted to do, but you don't think you could do? And I was like, well, I felt a bit embarrassed to say it and a bit shy, but I was like, look, well, I do watch a lot of these, poetry videos online, but obviously I can't do that. But, I enjoy it. And she said to me, you're going to do that. And I was like, well, no, I'm not. You can't make me do that. I'm going to do that. And she actually went and found an open mic night for me that was local. And so an open mic night, for anyone who doesn't know, is just where people can go and perform. They can read their poems, perform their poems, and it's, there's no strings attached. You just go and you can perform. And sometimes there's a competition element, like a slam element, where maybe people in the audience will judge and you can, come first, second, third, whatever. So she gave me this and she was like, you have to go to this and you have to write something for it. And I think for me, that was a really important moment because I think one of you mentioned it earlier that, you have written things, but it's that courage to share it, right? And I think that for me was a really important moment because it was like, actually the only person who can take that decision is me, and the only person who can make myself go is me. And so I didn't tell any of my friends, I didn't tell anybody, I kept it completely secret. And I wrote a poem specifically for this occasion because I hadn't really written any poems up to that point. And I wrote a poem that I look back on and I find it today like, oh, that's a bit cringy. But to be honest, I think it was very authentic to who I was at that time. And it was about feeling really unseen in the place that I was. I was studying at a university that was very elitist and very full of kind of racist assumptions, classist assumptions. And so for me, it was just a poem that was about what does it mean to be, visibly Muslim, brown woman in this place. And the reception that the poem got really shocked me because people were, I think it came second place they did a slam that evening. And I was really surprised because I think that was a moment for me where it kind of clarified something, which was that even though I hadn't written this poem and I hadn't gone to this event for any of the people there, I'd gone for me. I'd gone because I wanted to prove something to myself. I wanted to express something for myself. And yet, in that process, it had resonated with all these other people who, by the way, didn't share my experience at all. I felt quite awkward in that space. It was a space that I wouldn't usually have gone to if I hadn't had a reason to. I didn't know anybody there. But through this act of sharing my words, of reading about my experience and kind of sharing this thing I wanted to share, what I felt was that spoken word poetry provided something a bit different than just reading something online because it was this dialogue. I felt like it was a dialogue. And I'm sure any of you who have performed your work or read to an audience, it does feel like a dialogue because you're really getting something from the people there, and it changes every time. Who you're reading to will change the whole performance, it will change the whole experience. But more than anything, what I took from that was that there's something happening here, some magic that means that even though these people don't know what it feels like to be me, in this moment, they have felt with me something. And it's really hard to convey that, but the reason I think that's so important is that for me, it becomes the most important reminder that we do not write for an audience. Do not write for people, write for yourself. And I think a trap that a lot of people fall into when it comes to sharing poetry is, what kind of poetry will people want me to write? What kind of poetry is good? What kind of poetry is, gets applause? What kind of poetry will get viral video online? What kind of poetry will be shared? And I think that's such a flawed way to approach this because really poetry for me is about, it's about that self-expression. I think one of you mentioned that earlier. It's about storytelling. It's about I really think poetry is the only thing in the world, you can call me out on this if you think you disagree, but I think it's the only thing in the world that actually provides a way for you to express feelings. Perhaps all art does that, but I think poetry is the art that I really most resonate with, because it's like, I could write this thing as an essay, but who's going to read it? Who has time for that? Maybe a couple of dedicated people. But when you say a poem, you're not kind of restricted by sentences, by grammar, by all these rules, by the way that a story has to be told, by a linear kind of trajectory. You can just say your feelings, you can say what you're seeing, you can say what's happening, and it all can exist in one. And you just present it to people in this way where it's kind of an offering, and you're saying, look, this is what I'm feeling, here it is, this is what I'm seeing. And they have the option then to take it from you, to say, I feel that with you, I see it with you, or to say they don't. But it's that moment, I think, that's really exciting. So sorry, that was a huge segue from what I was going to talk about, but I think that's important, because that for me, that first experience of kind of doing it secretly, going on my own, was amazing. And it made me want to go back and go back again. And I went back every week, I think, or every fortnight. And I would write a different poem, especially for the occasion, and I would perform it. And, sometimes they would be really good, and sometimes they would just be like, okay. And sometimes I would be like, oh, that was not exactly what I wanted it to be. But I think that's also part of the process, right? Not expecting yourself to write something amazing every time you write. Because what would even be, how could that even be possible? And I think I would say, of things that I write, out of maybe like 50 attempts, there might be 2 that I'm like, oh, this is an okay idea. Like, I can maybe work with this. But I think a lot of people put a lot of pressure. We all do. I put pressure on myself as well. We all put pressure on ourselves to think, this is going to be the poem about this topic. And if it doesn't come out good, then I don't know what I'm going to do. And I think sometimes what's better is to take off that pressure, whether it's a pressure about what content, I think you've all mentioned, like, I think one of you, I think Sasha, you mentioned, that you kind of want to talk about this particular topic, or maybe a particular history related to your identity. But I mean, forgive me if I've kind of misquoted you there, but I think, sometimes the reason that's also difficult is because that maybe not the route into writing about it itself. The route in might be a feeling, or a image, or a smell, or something else. So yeah, I just think taking that pressure off is important to remember. And so anyway, I was performing, eventually got to know people, obviously, through doing this, got kind of a certain reputation. I was like, okay, I'm not too bad at this. And we took part in the university slam. So that's a slam, like a poetry slam, competition between different universities. So I went to that, and that was really eye-opening as well, because it was like, there's all these different ways to do poetry. Some people had styles that was like, if I tried to imitate that, it would be embarrassing. It would just look silly on me. I'm not very good at like funny poems. Some people are amazing at like comedy poems. Some people are amazing at story poems. Some people are amazing at narrative poems. And it made me realize there's all these different, ways that you can write. And it seemed that my way was, although different poems would be different, I felt like mine were often grounded in these small personal experiences. Somebody said something to me, I saw something, I felt something, and then I would use that to kind of zoom out and show a bigger story, or tell a bigger story. And so I think that's another really important thing, that there are all these different ways of sharing our feelings. And an important thing as well, I think, is to ask, like, who is a poet? Because I think in those spaces, at that time anyway, I was often the only person that was visibly Muslim, especially being a Muslim woman with a hijab. And I think that was always something as well that was a bit like, oh, does this mean that if I perform something about being Muslim, it will be seen as like, oh, of course she would, it's just, oh, another identity poem, is it just going to be about her trauma or whatever? And I think what I actually experienced at that university slam was, I recognized something that I didn't like about this kind of poetry, spoken word poetry, or something that can happen, was that I think there was a lot of, people felt pressure, I think, to kind of, maybe the way I would say it is like almost putting their trauma on display for people to consume. So if you were not white, it would be like, look, these, I'm not white, and this is all the horrible stuff that's happened. If you were a woman, I'm a woman, these are all the horrible things that happen. If you were queer, I'm queer, and these are all the horrible things that happen. And I think that's valid. I think it's completely valid to write about the violence that we experience, to write about the trauma that we, harbor, and all those things are completely valid. But I would just ask one question, which is, why are you writing? And it comes back to that for me always. why are we putting our trauma out there? Is there a way to still talk about our trauma and talk about the violence we experience, but without it being just simply consumed and taken by the audience? Because what I felt at the end of this, it was like set, it was all day long. You kind of have poetry slams. So it's like, you know, they're whittling down the numbers of teams until the final. And by the end of that day, I was so exhausted because I just felt like I've just taken on like all these people's feelings with no sort of, there's no feeling of like, okay, you know, I don't know, almost like responsibility or feeling of what we're going to do to resist this world that we know we live in. And I think, again, I don't think that's bad. I think that has a place. I think it's okay to make people feel that way. And actually, maybe people should have to sit with that feeling like I felt. You know, maybe I should have to feel that uncomfortable weight. But I think for me, what it also led me to kind of think more about was writing poems that were almost quite meta. So by that, I mean poems that really just exposed that process itself, that said in the poem, I'm struggling to write this poem without it becoming the poem that people want it to be. And so it was along those lines that I wrote the poem of mine that has been the most viral in my life and that kind of, I say, changed my life. So after university now, I'm living in London, and a friend of mine who was from the university team just said, oh, look, you know, you should apply for this poetry slam. And I was like, okay, sure, fine. I didn't know anything about it. And I got through, so I was like, okay, cool, you know, go to the rounds. So I think they kind of have different heats. So I went to the heat, and I performed one poem that I'd written ages ago, but I performed one poem that I had written with the knowledge that this was a poetry slam, right? And it was about what I've just said to you. It was kind of saying, the poem, the first line of the poem, and it's in my poetry collection, is, this poem is not for you. And it was really important to me that I was acknowledging that this poem within the context of a poetry slam. And I was saying, you know, I can talk about all these things, but you're going to think that I'm doing it for this reason, or you're going to think, oh, it's a race poem, oh, it's a feminism poem, oh. And I feel like in that moment where people think they've understood your poetry, they just can box it away and they can categorize you and be like, oh, so you do like Islamophobia poems, okay, got it. And I feel like when that happens, something about that for me is very dehumanizing, because that doesn't happen to white male poets, right? Nobody's like, oh, so you're a garden poet, you know, like, oh, you write about flowers, okay, that's your, you know, topic. And so I think it's something that's kind of doesn't sit right with me. And so I would also just, the reason I raised that really is just to really hammer home that original point, basically, which is write for yourself. Don't write for other people. Don't write in the style that you've seen, that even if you enjoy that style, experiment with it, sure, but don't try to just imitate what you've seen. Even when it's like, you know, I just think there's so many ways in which we can fall into the traps of trying to write for other people. And for me, that's part of a bigger trap of, you know, existing for other people, existing in other people's words, existing in other people's categories. And, you know, like you can even write a poem that, you know, that itself is, to me, is the content of a poem. You know, what are these words I have for myself? Like, where do they come from? Who even invented them? Like, the nationality that I give myself, where did that come from? Did I invent, you know, all these, and the thing is, those personal questions are immediately political, are immediately historical, are immediately about colonialism, about race, about gender, about modernity. And so I also say that just to remind you that when people ask me stuff like, you know, how do you write a political poem, or, you know, I really try to remind people that my poems are personal. All my poems are personal. They're not, it's not like I'm going, okay, I've just read this history book, I'm going to write a poem about history. Instead, it's the fact that all our experiences are historical and all our experiences are political. So, of course, you might be writing a poem specifically about, you know, I don't know, something that your brother said to you. But now that poem turns into this bigger reflection on society simply because we live in society. We are social beings. So, yeah, sorry, I'm getting very off my notes, but I think this is the problem with not being in a physical environment, because you'll see I'm very good at monologuing to myself, but please feel free to just post questions and stuff in the chat. Otherwise, we are going to do a Q&A in a bit as well. So what else did I want to say? Let me see. Yeah. Okay, so I think over time, I've begun to, my views on what poetry can do and what poetry is have changed. Thank you. On what poetry is and what it can do have changed. And I think that's come from experience, right? I think, and maybe this is something you might want to ask in the Q&A, but we can also leave it. But one thing I just wanted to also just say is that like I don't think, or I never used to think of myself as a confident person. I wouldn't think of myself, and I just want to say this in case somebody out there resonates with this, but I definitely resonate with being like introverted, being like somebody who doesn't enjoy socializing. And I still even find when I go to those poetry events, like I really wish that people wouldn't feel the need to like talk to me beforehand, and I wish that you could just perform and then like escape. But I respect and love all the people who are at those things. But I think what I mean to say is that wanting to share your words and wanting to share your stories is something that everybody feels. It's not something that's like, oh, I'm not an outgoing person, I'm not a confident person. I think we all have a right to share our stories and our voices. And so I just want to say that, and also to say that, you know, to me, it still comes as a surprise that I've been to all these places to perform my work, because I, you know, when I was like 18, I was just like, I don't even want to move city to go to a different university and talk to people, you know, I don't want to have to meet new people ever. So yeah, I just wanted to say that. But yeah, so my views of poetry have changed over time. And I think this answers some of the stuff you guys were talking about at the beginning. I really see poetry as a tool. I think poetry is one of the tools in what I would see as like my arsenal of weapons, right? I think, you know, but yeah, I think poetry is just one tool amongst many. So for me, you know, I don't know, other tools I might have include, you know, maybe I do also write those essays that I said can be a bit more boring, but I think they also have a place, you know. Maybe it is also worth giving talks sometimes, that's also a tool. Maybe sometimes just having a conversation, a one-on-one conversation with a friend, that's also a tool. Sometimes, you know, painting is a tool. Sometimes, you know, just creating space for somebody else to share their stories is a tool. And I think the reason I find it useful to think of it as a tool is that then I have to think about what the overall picture is. What's the overall, you know, what are all these tools helping me do? And I think broadly, like everybody who's in this group, from the things you've shared so far with me, there are overall things that you're interested in, and I would broadly categorize them as a better world, right? It sounds like you're all interested in a more just world. And I think that's a perfectly valid and very important thing to be invested in. And we're all going to be invested in that in small ways. That's going to affect our personal relationships with family members, with friends. It's also going to affect the ways that we interact with institutions in our lives. And so I guess the reason I find it useful to think of poetry as a tool is that when I look through history, the poets I'm most inspired by are people who use poetry as a tool. So for example, poetry to me has always been a tool of protest. So you look at prisoners. Prisoners have often been poets. Poetry of prisoners is a huge genre. So why is it that people who are caged, people who are locked away, people who are facing the violence of the state write poetry? For me, it goes back to that question. It's because poetry allows them to say something in a way that nothing else would. Okay, when I think as a Muslim as well, I think of, you know, the Quran is this book of divine knowledge, but it also comes to a culture at a time when people use poetry to tell stories. They use poetry to tell histories. They use poetry to even kind of, you know, almost like rap battles, yeah, to like assert your dominance over another people's. And if you think about the history of poetry in places like Persia, in places like South Asia, in places like North Africa, Somalia, poetry is, to me, something that has always been oral. So, you know, people kind of have the distinction between spoken word and written word. But to me, poetry we have to tell our stories in our voices, because that's just the way that it's always been. In my opinion, that's the way it's always been. It's important. The voice itself is a tool, you know, the tone that you tell your story in, the pace that you tell your story, where you leave the pauses, where you start getting choked up. All of that is part of the storytelling. It's not separate, in my opinion. And yeah, I think of poetry and I think of, you know, beat poets. I think of poetry and I think of Speaker's Corner. I think of poetry and I think of, you know, revolutionaries, anti-colonial resistors. I think of Black feminists. I think of all these people who've always used poetry in their arsenal. As I say, it's alongside these other weapons. They use poetry to tell a story that no other format would allow them to tell. And so to me, that's when poetry becomes exciting, because it's like, I know that poetry sometimes is the only tool that works in some situations. And by that, I mean, I think poetry really, the thing it can do that none of those other things can do is to disrupt. And by disrupting, I mean that you can say something, and because it's, you know, like with other things like an essay or a talk or something, you often have to kind of do this, you have to play along with this kind of these rules of like, you know, prove your point, evidence, explanation, you know, what's your argument, you know, the pros and cons. Whereas poetry, what's beautiful about it is that your feelings are legitimate. the evidence is your feelings. The evidence is your reality. You say it's unjust what I'm experiencing because it hurts. And that itself, people are like, yeah, of course that's true. And I think it helps us to speak on a more human level where you're not, nobody's saying, oh, prove to me that you're oppressed. It's like, of course the fact that you're hurt and I'm a human and I'm hearing you being hurt, that in itself is proof enough to me that this is an experience that I care about. So I think when I kind of think of the things that poetry can do for me, there's like three things that I usually kind of split it into. And one is that I think it can reveal things, in ways that other things can't. So you can reveal a kind of a structural dynamic, you can reveal a process of injustice, you can reveal a history, but you can do it in a very subtle way. And again, it might be, I'm sharing my feeling, but now I'm sharing my feeling, what I'm going to reveal to you is this feeling is shared by, a million people. This feeling is not just a feeling, it's caused by this history, this structure, this violence, whatever it is. And so I think by revealing things, we actually, the word that I've seen used is denaturalize. We show that they're not natural, right? So if I, so for example, if I, so actually, let's go back to that poem that I was telling you about with that slam. So in that slam, I don't even know if I finished the story. This is chaotic storytelling right now, but I performed in that slam, and then the final poem that I performed, it went viral. It got like 2 million views online. People were inviting me all over the world, and that was really exciting. But the poem was really the beginning of that poem. The message of that poem is just that there's this poem that wants me to write it, and it's a poem that's asking me to humanize myself. But I won't write that poem. I don't want to write that poem. And I'm feeling the urge to write it. So you see, that goes back to what I was saying earlier about kind of that meta thing. The other thing to say is that sometimes, what's the other thing to say? Sorry. In writing that poem, I also showed something that I couldn't necessarily give a name to before writing that poem, which was that, look, there is this pressure for me to prove that I am human. And if that pressure for me to prove I'm human exists, then I am not seen as human to start with. And so I revealed something there. You see, through sharing my feelings, through sharing, I had this feeling that, I should write a poem that's X, Y, Z. Now I'm revealing that the pressure to write that poem is in fact a structural racism. I hope I'm not being too abstract. I hope that makes sense, but we can talk more about that if not. But to me, so it's revealing, that's one thing. Two, it holds the mirror up. So you use your personal experience to actually hold the mirror to the audience and say, look, if you have made me feel this way, if I live in a world in which I feel this way, what does it say about you? And so I think, whilst it is useful, as I say, to write those poems where we talk about our trauma and our experiences, I think it is more useful to use them to say, what does that say about you? If I'm feeling this, what does that mean? Why? What's the function of me feeling that? And finally, though, one of the most beautiful things I think about poetry is that it does validate other people, right? So I think the poem that I've talked about, the one at the Roundhouse, it's called This Is Not a Humanizing Poem. And I think for other Muslim people or other people who shared that experience with me, for them, it wasn't a matter of, oh, you've revealed something we never knew existed. Instead, it was, oh, this is something that I also experienced. So I think poetry has a really big role in also helping us to feel validated, helping us to feel seen, and helping us to see other people. And I think that's a really beautiful thing. So one final thing that I just wanted to mention is the form of poetry, right? A style of poetry. I think sometimes people feel poetry is like a particular form, or poetry is a particular set of rules. And I think that can be a big barrier. And again, going back to why working with children is so much easier, is because they don't feel those barriers. They don't feel like I've got to follow a certain set of rules. They tend to just go with the flow. And I would say, style develops over time. But what I would say is don't worry too much about how you're writing. I think poetry is not a form of writing. It actually goes back to that thing about feeling. To me, the most important thing that the best poems do is that they're honest. And that might sound really simple, but I think honesty is really overlooked because, as I say, you're trying to imitate another style, or you're trying to write what you think people will think is good, or you're trying to write what people will applaud, or what you think you've seen somebody else do. But I think the more honest you are, and it's counterintuitive, the more honest you are and the more personal and more vulnerable your work, the more people will resonate with it. And that does sound counterintuitive because you think if it's more personal, how can anybody resonate? This is too personal. But in fact, we're all human beings, we're all flawed. And when we see somebody else in pain, or we see somebody else having certain experience, I think it just connects us more to our own humanity, because we realize there's something in each of us that is you know, vulnerable and that is kind of feels all those different things. So yeah, and I just want to say with that final point as well that, you know, when we talk about how do we write poems that are about history or about politics or about all these other kind of structural things, again, I think write personal poems, and your personal poem will be that political poem just because of the nature of the world you live in. Okay, I'm gonna just pause there now. And what I want us to do is a little exercise. So I'm just trying to make sense of my notes, which are like really chaotic. Like I don't know why I wrote them like this, but I am going to show you. I'm going to read a little excerpt now from this woman and this writer. She, I think, is the reason that I chose to ever share my work in the first place. Her name is Audre Lorde. Some of you may be familiar with her, some of you may not. She's a very well-known Black lesbian poet from the USA, and she is a writer, a poet, but a political revolutionary, really a radical, somebody who really spoke about the nature of things as they were. Yeah, so I'm just going to read an excerpt from her. So she was diagnosed with cancer in her lifetime, and she wrote, these are called the Cancer Diaries, and she writes about why that diagnosis leads her to share her words. And I hope you don't mind me just reading, actually, maybe for a couple of minutes, just an excerpt from, but yeah, I just want to read this, and I hope maybe this could explain a bit about why I was so inspired to share my writing. Because I think many of you have mentioned that you write a lot, but you just don't share it. So she says, I have come to believe over and over again that what is most important to me must be spoken, made verbal, and shared, even at the risk of having it bruised or misunderstood, that the speaking profits me beyond any other effect. I am standing here as a Black lesbian poet, and the meaning of all that waits upon the fact that I am still alive and might not have been. Less than 2 months ago, I was told by 2 doctors that I would have to have breast surgery and that there was a 60 to 80% chance the tumor was malignant. Between that telling and the surgery, there was a 3-week period of agony. The surgery was completed and the growth was benign. But within those weeks, I was forced to look upon myself and my living with a harsh and urgent clarity that has left me still shaken, but much stronger. This is a situation faced by many women, by some of you here today. Some of what I experienced during that time has helped elucidate for me much of what I feel concerning the transformation of silence into language and action. And so she connects there, you see, language and action. So then she says, in becoming forcibly and essentially aware of my mortality and of what I wished and wanted for my life, however short it might be, and priorities and omissions became strongly etched in a merciless light, and what I most regretted were my silences. Of what had I ever been afraid? To question or to speak as I believed could have meant pain or death, but we all hurt in so many different ways all the time, and pain will either change or end. Death, on the other hand, is the final silence. And that might be coming quickly now, without regard for whether I had ever spoken what needed to be said or had only betrayed myself into small silences while I planned someday to speak or waited for somebody else to speak. And I began to recognize a source of power within myself that comes from the knowledge that while it is most desirable not to be afraid at all, learning to put fear into perspective gave me great strength. I was going to die, if not sooner than later, whether or not I had ever spoken myself. My silences had not protected me. Your silence will not protect you. And I end it there. There's a lot more that you can read it. I'll just post it in the chat. But the reason I share that, and I think it's so motivating, is that question really feels true to me. You know, what is stopping us from speaking? Why do we hold our silences? Why? I think there's another, I think it's Nayyirah Waheed, poet, who she just has a very simple short poem that just says, that poem that you're most afraid to write that. I think it's Nayyirah Waheed, I could be misquoting. So just saying that and having read that and letting that sit with us, I just want us to think about the silences that we do keep, the things that we haven't put into words yet, maybe because we don't have the words, maybe because we can't find the words, or maybe because putting them into words feels hard, difficult. And I just want you to take a second, put your pen to paper, and maybe you just write, and it can just be a list. It can be as simple as a list, and you can just write, maybe as the title, you can write the silences I have kept, and then you can just write a list of, I am afraid, ... I am afraid ... And maybe you're answering a question, maybe you're just saying what you're afraid of. Maybe, I'm afraid people won't like my work. I'm afraid my writing will be rubbish. I'm afraid I won't be as good as I used to be. I'm afraid I'll be rejected. I'm afraid no one will clap. So I'm going to give you 4 or 5 minutes. Just a list. And you're not going to have to share this. This is just for yourself. Just to see our fears, I think, helps make them much smaller. Maybe just finish up the idea that you're on. Maybe just have a read through what you've written so far. And yeah, just have a think as well what else is coming to mind right now, because I think this is a very vulnerable exercise, and it can make us have to confront maybe the things that are most painful in our realities. And yeah, I would love to hear from anybody. You don't have to read what you've written, but you might just want to maybe share some reflections on what that quote from Audre Lorde inspired you to think about, or just how it's left you feeling, or if it's made you realize anything new about what we talked about in our introduction, some of us. And maybe first, does anybody just want to share any reflections? Or even share your list, and you can share it and we can just give no comment. You can just share what you're afraid of, or you can share some reflections.
Well, what I'm afraid of. I'm afraid that I'll say something wrong, or that I say wrongly, that I will hurt others, that it will bring consequences, as in more violence and more stigma. I'm afraid that I'm uncertain and I change my mind and I'm in doubt and I don't know how, and it seems like it casted in something when it's written. I'm afraid I will steal someone else's story. I'm afraid it won't be really how I feel or how I want. And I'm afraid that I can't do it.
Oof, it
was a long list.
But you know what, Goya, I look at the group, and maybe if other people feel the same, you can raise your hand, but I feel like all those fears that you shared are so relatable. And I think it's really reassuring to me, because it reminds me that none of us are alone in those fears, those webs of fears that we build and that have been put upon us. And actually, one that I thought was really beautiful that you said was the fear of telling a story that's not yours. And I think, I don't know if you wanted to expand on that, but if you don't mind me just reflecting on that as well, from my perspective, I feel like that's something that's so real, because I think we are products of other people's stories as well, right? We're the products of our parents' stories, our grandparents' stories, our family stories, our friends' stories, our circumstances. And I think when you are a writer, or when you want to write, you sometimes do feel unsure that, I've written poems, for example, about my grandparents, and I sometimes think, is that fair? Is that their story to tell? Am I telling it in my own? Of course I'm telling it in my own words. And can that ever be fair? But I just think that's a really beautiful thing as well, because I think when we, just going back to the thing about people talking earlier about wanting to write political poems, and something that I don't really like, and other people can have different opinions, but I don't like it when people write poems about like political issues, quote unquote, that they've never experienced, because I think there's something so tokenistic about that as well. And I think, going back to this point that I've been trying to hammer to you throughout this today, is that I think poetry has to be honest above everything else, and honesty and authenticity can't go together, in my opinion. So I just really appreciated that reflection, Goya. And I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I have that similar issue of like taking stories from other people, like who has the right to tell the story. And in many cases, because in relative terms, I have lived a privileged life. Like I work with, I just have to say like this little thing. I have worked for many years with young adults whose parents were part of an armed group in Peru, and as such have been condemned as terrorists. And some of them were killed, some others were exiled, some are still in prison. So I work with the second generation, which is a bit younger than me, but my generation in some sense. And I feel like in this, I have been privileged in that sense, because I don't live in the same country and under the same stigma and conditions. So I'm afraid, do I have the right to tell the story? This is, even though...
You know what, I think that just because of, and you missed some of the introductions at the beginning, I think, but we all had stories that spanned. It was interesting when everyone introduced themselves. They didn't start with, oh, I'm such and such. It was like, my family is from this place, or I'm in this place because of these things. And I actually think that what you're talking about is a poem in of itself. That struggle, that whose story is this? Is it mine to tell? And I think this goes to that thing of those meta poems, the poems about the struggle to write poems. And I think when you write, if you were to write something like that, I think the honesty in it would be so clear, and your own struggle and your own kind of recognition that the writing can be an act of violence in itself, right? I think you recognizing that through your writing would it in itself be actually a really make for a troubling poem. And I think troubling poems are really important, poems that make us think and make us uncomfortable. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing, Goya. Just for sake of time, I'm gonna ask somebody else, maybe somebody who didn't introduce themselves as well, to share either just who you are or what you're feeling at this moment.
Yeah, I feel a bit of a fraud because I didn't start writing till late last year. I didn't start acting till I was 50. I've had reasonably successful career as an actor. I started stand-up last year because it frightened me and I wanted to be challenged.
That's so cool.
And yeah, I just feel like I've put on the chat about the fact that I feel kind of out of time, like I should have done this in my 30s. And I feel like, yeah, I feel like a bit of a dinosaur sometimes, I'll be honest. Yeah, I just feel a little bit frustrated that I'm out of time, I'm too late, and I've not really made the most of what I feel I could contribute. I do feel frustrated that maybe I've missed the boat and people people don't want to listen to me. That's what I feel a little bit.
That makes a lot of sense, Michael.
Or not.
No, I really appreciate you sharing that, because I actually feel like, as much as what you're telling us is obviously very personal, and I really appreciate your honesty, actually, because I think it takes a lot of vulnerability to say those fears. But when I was listening to you, I was also thinking, isn't that just the human condition as well? I feel like what you're saying is so, as much as it is personal and as much as it is related, I suppose, to your experience in life, I think that feeling that we're always too late, that we're always coming to things that we should have come to before, that you know, that we wasted time. I feel like that's something as well that we all can relate to on some level. I think everybody harbors those fears and those regrets, or even the regret that, you know, I could have done this thing, but I've held myself back, or I haven't. But you say all of that, and then you also told us all these things that it seems that you said you're learning every single day. You said you did stand-ups from last year, and I feel to me your actual life experience is almost a lesson in itself that goes against what you're saying about this idea of, you know, feeling outdated or whatever. And I think those feelings are so valid, and I think the society we live in actually cultivates that. I think it's not an accident that you feel that way. I think people are made to feel that, you know, you're past your, you know, expiry date now. There's no, you can't contribute. Whereas I think if the reality is, if it is true that we're all human and that we share experiences, then what you've just said, I mean, I felt really moved by it, and I think other people in the group probably did. And if that's true, then that would suggest that there's no date, there's no age to feelings and to honesty and vulnerability. And that comes back to really that same message that I keep saying, which is that I think writing which is honest is writing that is always going to be powerful, that is going to last through the ages, because we all share those fears, we all share those vulnerabilities. And yeah, I just really appreciated you sharing that. And I think, yeah, somebody's put in the chat there, quite a few people have said there that, yeah, thank you for saying that. I was also afraid I'd not make sense, so thanks. Yeah, so yeah, does anybody else want to, sorry, just share, just for time's sake as well, does anybody else want to share anything? Michael, I really appreciate that.
I joined because I really wanted to learn more about the barriers that are there in writing structurally, but also like internally that we all have. Some of the things that I'm afraid of are being policed because of my writing. So essentially, like being afraid of state violence due to my writing, because some things you say which are not like politically popular and saying like no matter where you live, and so I'm afraid of the harm that would come to me and loved ones. I'm also afraid of insincerity. Like I don't want to do it for the clout of it. Like I just want to do it because I believe that it's right to do it. And like Michael, I think I'm afraid of like not having enough time as well. But maybe, yeah. And like Goya, I'm afraid of like stealing someone else's story. So in my case, it's like accidentally plagiarizing something because I haven't read enough books yet. So
you can't plagiarize something you haven't read. I think you're safe. But I really appreciate that, Aisha, because I think actually you made me think about another thing, which is that what you said about you fear kind of the repercussions of the state, that you could be silenced. I mean, I also find such inspiration in poets who have written in those circumstances, and there's such a history of poets who've written this. And I mean, you're from Pakistan. I mean, there's a very clear history of poets from Pakistan who had to write in very coded ways to critique their governments because of the state violence that they would face and the state violence that they did face, right? And I think that to me is also a good reminder that when we talked about poetry earlier as a tool, it can be this very live tool. It can be this ammunition, right? That's like actually has a really huge potential. And to me, it just proves the power of poetry, that governments try to coerce and silence poets. That tells you everything you need to know. Poetry must be something incredibly powerful, and it must be something incredibly moving and like movement building for it to be needed to be silenced. And so I guess what I would say to you is, maybe find inspiration from poets who have written in those coded ways, maybe, write extended metaphors, maybe make the sun the state, talk about, a garden, which is really, and I think those kinds of, thinking about those kinds of metaphors is a really, that's a really classic thing that poets have done, using metaphors to talk about other things. And I think actually, if I'm not mistaken, I went to a workshop about the form of ghazals in particular, and how throughout history and like both Persian and like Urdu ghazals and different cultures of ghazals, that they have often been used in that coded way to talk about something much more political. So yeah, definitely really appreciate that. And maybe we move into the next exercise, and then the last few people could also share on the basis of that. And then maybe we can just have a little Q&A, because I just want us to have one chance to do this. One more thing. But I hope what we've done so far has also just really, if more than anything else, just made you think about the reasons that you do or don't write. So what I want to do this one, I just want to share this poem. I'm going to read it, but I'm also going to share the screen with you so you can read it with me. So this is a poem by Assata Shakur, who is a Black revolutionary from the USA. She's currently in Cuba in hiding because she was on the USA's most wanted list. So we talked about people who write and they fear state persecution, right? She was in prison and put on trial for kind of different charges, which were really just fabricated because she just posed a revolutionary threat to the state. So we're going to read her poem that's called I Believe in Living. And I think it's a beautiful poem. And I think she also kind of, just to speak to what Aisha was talking about, she talks about things through the use of images and metaphors when she's really talking about things that we know are much more political. And I just want to share this as well, because I think people sometimes think, and I myself, to be honest, do this a lot. Like when I am writing poems that are political, I'm quite explicit about the politics. But that comes with privilege. That comes with the privilege of my platform as well. I know that the more people that follow my work, the easier it is for me to say quite outrageous things, because it's harder for me to be silenced. But I also recognize there are lots of different ways to write about these things, and I think that's important. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm also going to read this. So I Believe in Living by Assata Shakur, so you should be able to see and follow. So it goes like this. I believe in living. I believe in the spectrum of better days and gamma people. I believe in sunshine, in windmills and waterfalls, tricycles and rocking chairs. And I believe that seeds grow into sprouts and sprouts grow into trees. I believe in the magic of the hands and in the wisdom of the eyes. I believe in rain and tears and in the blood of infinity. I believe in life. And I have seen the death parade march through the torso of the earth, sculpting mud bodies in its path. I have seen the destruction of the daylight and seen bloodthirsty maggots prayed to and saluted. I have seen the kind become the blind, and the blind become the bind in one easy lesson. I have walked on cut grass. I have eaten crow and blunder bread and breathed the stench of indifference. I have been locked by the lawless, handcuffed by the haters, gagged by the greedy, and if I know anything at all, is that a wall is just a wall and nothing more at all. It can be broken down. I believe in living. I believe in birth. I believe in the sweat of love and in the fire of truth. And I believe that a lost ship steered by tired, seasick sailors can still be guided home to port. So I love that poem personally. Yeah, I think is, to me, like when I was approaching poetry, you know, earlier in my life, I think that was a lesson to me that you don't have to write statistical poems. You don't have to write poems that list, you know, in a very didactic, like lecture-like way. Her poem and it being rooted in I believe it, somehow you leave it feeling so motivated. Somehow you leave it knowing you're not alone in the struggle. You know there's this future. You know there are people who care, and just by caring, things are possible. And to me, that's hugely inspiring. And so I just thought maybe what we could do is take 5 minutes and you write an I believe poem. Write your version of an I believe poem. What do you believe? What do you believe for yourself? What do you believe for you want to do, for who you are, for where you want to go? And it may just be every sentence begins with I believe. Maybe every stanza begins with I believe. It may lead to something else. Just start with I believe. It doesn't have to be a poem. Just feel like you're writing. It's a free write. You're just writing whatever comes to mind. I'm also going to write. Let's take 5 minutes. And when we come back, maybe a couple of people can share if they want to, and maybe the rest of us can just, you know, share some reflections. Also, if you feel like you're struggling, a really good trick is to just not allow yourself to pause. So even if you're writing rubbish, just keep going. And you can even write like, why is she making me keep writing? This is awful. I have no ideas. My brain is just empty. I can't write anything. I'm so rubbish at this. That's fine. But try to add in I believe at some point. So take 5 minutes and go. Okay, so if you just start finishing up where you're at, even if it's a bit random, that's fine. You can expand on this later. You can turn this into a poem later. You can do whatever you want later. This was just a little exercise. So hopefully you've all got something. Some of you might want to share it. Some of you might not want to share it. Some of you, it might just be one line in it that you really liked. I'm just going to share what I wrote just to show you what drafting is, to show you that not everything is great the first time when you write it, but that you might have something in it that you love. So I just wrote this, really random. I believe in love. I believe we can build that better world, even if we can't see it yet, because I believe in the unseen. I believe in forces that intervene. I believe in taking the leap, in having faith, in trust, in listening. I believe you will never be worse off for holding someone's tears. I believe we are each other's vassals. I believe in hope. I believe in trying. I believe in trying even when it's really hard. That's when I was finding it hard to write. I believe it's hard for a reason. I believe everything has a reason, but I also believe in the unreasonable. I will not be limited by the reasonable. And so you see, just sometimes even just by following a certain pattern of list, that can be a really good route for a poem. That can be a good basis. And it might just be that there was one line in there I liked. But there you go. You have things to build with. You have things to work on, and that can be a really political poem. That could then turn into why I believe, you know, we can abolish structures of violence, and that could turn into that. I could then start naming those things. But I think to bring people in, using my feelings, saying I believe in love, and that can be the basis of it. Would anybody like to share what they've written?
I did go through a phase where I didn't know what I was writing, really. I did feel like I was writing random rubbish. I just thought nobody's going to get me and no one's going to understand what I'm talking about. So I used to hide a lot of it. And then I started going out a little bit with my writing. And then I just sort of thought, I just went to have a look around and I just thought, you know what, I'm just going to go do my own thing. And when I just didn't attach myself to anything and did my own thing, I became more comfortable inside myself and in my writing.
There you go. I feel like, Manzoor, you have just managed to concisely get across the message that I've been babbling on about. But that is, to me, that's such an inspiring and reassuring message that you're saying, that you hated what you were writing rubbish, you didn't enjoy it, and then you just decided to drop all the ideas that you might have had, follow whatever you were feeling, and there, in that authenticity and that honesty and that sincerity, you found the voice you'd been looking for the whole time. I think it's like all those other things. I think it's like, people talk about falling in love and they're like, when you're looking for it, it doesn't happen. When you're not looking, I mean, I feel like poetry is like love in that way, that when you're not looking, you suddenly write the best poems. But Yeah, thank you, Masara. I really appreciate that. Would anybody like to share what they wrote? Aisha, you say this is what I wrote. Do you want to read it to us, Aisha, or you just want to share it in the chat?
I can read it. I'll just read it from there. I believe in justice, but also mercy. I believe whether we want the same or not, we are the same in wanting. I believe the earth can heal after it has been scorched, that the moon returns, and that my words are heard even if only by God.
Ooh, I love that. Gave me chills on my back. That's gorgeous. I feel like, oh, I love when people can encapsulate so much in such a short space. That is not my strength, and that is, I really thank you for sharing that. It was beautiful. Michael, would you like to read yours to us?
I believe everyone can. Everyone deserves to be heard. Everyone needs to breathe. Everyone can make a difference. Everyone needs to laugh. Everyone deserves to believe.
Beautiful. I love the changing up of needy. Deserving to be heard and then deserving to believe. I think that's yeah. I feel like also these poems often gets the essence of who we are as humans and are really relatable in that way. Oh, here we go, another one. Sasha, would you like to read yours to us, or would you just like us to read it?
I guess I started off, I believe in hope, and I've been thinking about hope a lot. So especially when you feel really helpless. So I believe in hope, and my hope believes in freedom. My hope that believes in choice. My hope lives in every story of justice. My hope is strong in belief, and my hope is shy and introverted. And my hope is the modest and the extrovert. My hope celebrates, my hope dances. My hope shouts in solidarity, and my hope cries in pain. And my hope grows, and my hope spreads. My hope lives and breathes, and my hope will outlive your hate.
Okay, beautiful. I feel like in such a short space and with such a simple format, that's actually told me more about you than I would have learned in any kind of, introduction or chat. And I think, yeah, the last line in particular, yeah, beautiful. Yeah, please all share your responses to each other as well in the chat, because, yeah, thank you, Sasha. That was gorgeous. And what I really like as well with that format is when people can include the contradictions. And I think that's really powerful to say both that your hope is dancing, but also that it's crying in pain, because that makes us, as a listener, as somebody who's having this image projected on my brain, I'm asking myself, if your hope is both dancing but also crying in pain, then, what your hope is multifaceted. What does that mean? If your hope is multifaceted, what does that mean? If your hope is, I think and as a listener, that's what you want. You want to be having to do those kind of little somersaults and flips and trying to understand. So, yeah, I really appreciate that. Did anybody else like to share? Ariane, yeah, please.
I believe the power of the words. The words can heal us, can damage our soul. I believe that problems are not too big. We are too small, that we cannot handle them. I believe that a better days, a new shining will shine to our life. Just we need to stay strong and never give up. I believe that the pains and cries of refugees will be finished one day.
Ooh, that was really gorgeous. Thank you, Ariane. That made me feel really emotional, actually. Really appreciate you sharing that. And I think sometimes, this is why I also think the voice is such an important part of the poem and the way that you deliver that to us, because I think your feelings and your sincerity was so clear in that, and your hope just shone through. And I think your hope is, how do I put this in words? Like, your hope makes the heart it makes my heart quiver, because it's just like, for you to have such big hope and such big love, it makes me feel like so much is possible. And I just really appreciate you sharing that and writing. And I think also your belief in the power of words is clear. You fulfill it at the end by the fact that you made us feel so much through your words. So thank you so much. Would anybody else like to share, or just reflections or comments or thoughts, or even how this process was for you, if you found it a bit tough, or if you found it useful, or anything? I'm going to make you wait in an awkward silence till somebody announces. Well, no, that's fine. If not, that's fine. I have really loved this space that you guys have helped us create today. And I really appreciate you all staying, even though, we've been bouncing around, different people have very different experiences. But I actually think what I've taken from today is that it's kind of reassured to me and reinforced and reminded that vulnerability and honesty are the heart of poetry, because I think poetry is the only thing that gives language to those things. You can't write an essay, you can't write a speech, you could, but I think those things won't carry as well or convey as powerfully what you all have just shared about those innate human things and feelings, and the things that, as I said earlier on, as personal as they may feel, they resonate because we are all human. And I think stories of violence and trauma and tragedy and heartache and hope are global in scale and are very personal at the same time. So yeah, thank you so much. I feel really inspired after this, and I hope that maybe you've taken from one another as well. And I hope you all go away and write something. That's maybe one ask I will ask of you. Please, either just extend what you wrote or write something completely new, or just sit in your chair for 5 more minutes and write something, or come back and write something. But I think, yeah, and I would love also, feel free to email me at any point. I'm going to put my email in the chat. I would love to, hear from any of you. And I would love to this. I'm going to hand back over to Kirsty because I feel like I'm just banging end.
Oh, thank you so much, Suhaiymah. That was such an inspiring space that you just held for us there, and I can tell that people have got a lot out of it. And thank you so much to everyone just for contributing like that. I have got goosebumps as well. And Suhaiymah, I think you gave so many golden nuggets of wisdom. Link us up with where we can find some of your work as well, so we can share it on Twitter, because that would be ace.
Yeah, if you have, so I actually have a poetry collection, which is called Post-Colonial Banter. Sorry, I'm trying to spell it. I can't spell and speak. Post-Colonial Banter. And you can follow me on Twitter or Instagram at the Brown Hijabi. And I have a website, suhaiymah.com. But also just email me. I would just love to keep in touch with you all. And yeah.
Oh, that's such a great offer, and thank you everybody, and hopefully we'll see you in another space soon. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.